I get people's hesitancy around conflicts even remotely involving oil, but there's much more to this than just cheaper oil. Having a Venezuelan government that is willing to open up their oil market to the West could be an avenue away from European dependence on Russian oil, which takes away from the only money flow large enough to prop up the Russian economy and war effort. So I have to preface this video now by saying that it was recorded on Friday morning, the 2nd, mere hours before the US special operation to capture and arrest Nicolás Maduro. And so the first half of the video becomes less of a where we are now, or where we were as of Friday morning, to what led up to his arrest. So if you're less worried about what led up to his arrest and more worried about what the title of the video is and how this is different from previous regime changes, go ahead and skip to around halfway through the video. But I appreciate you checking it out, and let's get back into the video. President Trump paved the way for greater intervention by essentially declaring the Venezuelan regime itself a foreign terrorist organization via the Cartel de los Soles, a decentralized network of government officials and traffickers, citing their complicity in drug smuggling and human trafficking. He also said they need to return to the United States all of the oil, land, and other assets that they previously stole from us. And many people might be confused by what Venezuela owes the US, but it's likely a reference to the 2007 expropriation of US oil assets in the Orinoco region, when then dictator Hugo Chavez forcefully took over oil operations to complete his effort to nationalize the industry, and has only paid back a small fraction of what it owes to companies like Exxon and Conoco, even after legal claims had been adjudicated by international courts, who deemed the seizures illegal. The projects were valued at over $30 billion at the time, and the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes has ordered Venezuela to pay over $10 billion back to the companies. And the regime has only paid $255 million to Exxon while continuing to dispute the other debts. Many of these developments come shortly after the release of the new national security strategy, which I have a video on talking about the new regional spheres of influence and asserting a U.S. focus on the Americas. The Maduro regime has responded by calling the blockades a grotesque threat, but that's all they can really do about it right now. They certainly aren't going to kick off any engagements with the U.S. military and are likely relying on either Chinese intervention or sympathetic U.S. internal pressure to get them out of the pinch. China is the biggest buyer of Venezuelan oil, which accounts for roughly 4% of their imports. And while in the short term China has enough oil to get by, if the blockade continues for any extended period of time, then either OPEC is going to have to reach into their reserves to supply China, China will have to step in and relieve the pressure being forced on Venezuela, or Maduro will have to be forced out in order to resume oil exports.
Okay. Number 3!
But timing is important. The Venezuelan oil sector accounts for over 80% of the country's exports and almost 20% of the total GDP. So the longer the blockade continues, the more their economy will suffer, and the more Venezuelans are likely to flee to surrounding countries. And those countries already have many Venezuelan expats from the previous 2 decades. U.S. tensions with the regimes under Chavez and now Maduro obviously did not spring up this year. The U.S. has imposed targeted sanctions on Venezuelan individuals and entities since 2005, and have sanctioned government officials since 2014 for human rights violations, with major economic sanctions ramping up in Trump's first term, particularly against the state-owned Petróleos de Venezuela, preventing them from accessing the U.S. financial markets. Trump imposed numerous other sanctions against Maduro in his first term, and while the Biden administration eased some of those sanctions in an effort to push for fair and free elections in 2024, the strong allegations against the Maduro regime of strong-arming the National Elections Council reinvigorated the push for regime change. It doesn't help that the Venezuelans have suffered major economic collapse since Maduro took over, with output shrinking significantly and rampant hyperinflation contributing to a scarcity of basic goods. Venezuela's GDP shrank by roughly 75% between 2014 and 2021, due to the plunge in oil prices from over $100 per barrel in 2014 to under $30 in 2016, leading to hyperinflation of over 130,000% in 2018, and remaining at 190% in 2023, according to the Venezuelan Central Bank and International Monetary Fund. White House spokesperson Anna Kelly said that the national security strategy reflects what the administration sees as a historic realignment of U.S. foreign policy, which we've seen over the past few months with the military strikes on drug smuggling boats in the Caribbean. Between September and December, the U.S. has carried out 29 strikes against small boats they claim to be smuggling drugs and other illicit materials. And while I don't have any qualms about the military taking out traffickers of any kind, positive identification of people you're going to kill is generally a pretty good thing. And in reality, we don't have any idea of what was on those boats. Just because 3 out of 4 small boats intercepted by the Coast Guard were successful drug disruption operations, that still means there's a 25% chance that there's nothing illegal on board. If these people were positively identified as threats, that's probably something the military should release to remove the doubt we're seeing. Leaving any room for people to question your judgment is not very good optics, regardless of intent or execution. President Trump hinted at potential land strikes targeting drug operations a few weeks ago, before it was reported that the CIA struck a remote dock on the Venezuelan coast that the US government believed was being used by the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua to store drugs and move them onto boats for shipping. He also said that strikes may extend beyond Venezuela, saying it doesn't necessarily have to be in Venezuela. People that are bringing drugs into our country are targets. The problem here is the actual effectiveness of essentially playing whack-a-mole with smugglers. Sure, you can take out a smuggler or two with a $100,000 Hellfire missile, but there will always be someone that pops up to fill the slot. Plus, if we're not putting too much work into positively identifying targets, then we might run into a lot more unintended consequences. The Maduro regime is not just sitting idly by while all of this goes on either. Like all authoritarian regimes, in the face of collapse, they're doing even more to restrict opposition and incentivize supporters not to jump ship. And in recent days, the regime has detained several Americans, likely as bargaining chips. As Alonso Molero describes in the Spanish news outlet El País, the revolutionary state now invests more time and money into restructuring and strengthening over 5,000 communes to ensure territorial control and economic development across the country by establishing a greater presence of his Bolivarian militia within them. The ruling United Socialist Party of Venezuela recently held an unusual plenary session, during which it agreed to move to an armed phase of the revolution, grounded in the Maoist principle of protracted people's war, should any aggression against the country actually materialize. Maduro personally instructed the defense minister Vladimir Pedrino Lopez to expedite the enlistment and operational readiness of public administration workers, ordering him to distribute weapons and prepare for national defense in every factory in the country. That being said, I don't think the reports or videos of officials handing out AKs to civilians is anything more than strongman propaganda, since handing out weapons to a populace that largely dislikes you is not the best idea. Maduro has also asked civilian groups to meet in an assembly for constitutional reforms that would change the election regulation, undermining regional autonomy and political pluralism, and increasing the role of the armed forces in advancing the current government's political objectives. For nearly 2 years now, the Maduro government has been developing a system to consolidate communal projects through what it calls the National Popular Consultation. This would give significantly more political control and power to Maduro-supporting communes, rivaling formal government institutions. The more top-down push is combined with a bottom-up grassroots movement for Chavista militants to report their political environment in their communities, as well as report political enemies through the government-created Ven app. However, like most authoritarian regimes, they're not very popular. According to several qualitative analyses of opinion surveys conducted in 2024 and 2025, these collectivist management models are now viewed with suspicion and indifference by the vast majority of Venezuelans, although the regime views that as an effect of external influences rather than internal failure. All this is to say that in a similar fashion to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un, it doesn't look like Maduro and his cronies are going to accept defeat before driving their country into utter financial and political ruin. The question becomes, how involved should we be in all of this and why? And there are levels to that. Some might say that we should stick to what affects us directly, like going after cartels and smugglers in the US or on their way here. Others might say that we should be using passive economic and political measures as a means of influence and change. And some might say that we should be using the passive measures as well as active military strikes to go after cartel organizations at the roots and push a more US-friendly, anti-cartel regime into power. And let's be real, the first, more hands-off approach condemns us to an endless money pit of playing cat and mouse with smugglers. We need to destroy their roots if we want these problems to go away, insofar as they can. So that leaves the other two. And it would be great if we could passively dismantle cartels and influence a better regime into power. But based on Maduro's continually tightening grip on power, his relationship with cartels, and the history of authoritarian regimes, it may take a little bit more than sanctions and seizing a few oil tankers to make that happen. And to be clear, that doesn't mean a boots-on-the-ground invasion. Our almost $1 trillion per year military has plenty of active capabilities that don't require ground troops. I get people's hesitancy around conflicts even remotely involving oil, but there's much more to this than just cheaper oil. Having a Venezuelan government that is willing to open up their oil market to the West could be an avenue away from European dependence on Russian oil, which takes away from the only money flow large enough to prop up the Russian economy and war effort. And in a moment where peace talks seem to be progressing, this would only give the US and Ukraine more leverage. Having a Venezuelan government that isn't aiding Iran and its proxies weakens the Ayatollah's influence at a time when its currency is plummeting and anti-government protests are sweeping the nation. And most importantly, having a Venezuelan government that can be brought back into Western markets will create significantly better economic conditions for the people of Venezuela and South America more generally. American military actions do not have to create destabilizing power vacuums if there's actually a plan to follow, and Venezuela has much better conditions for change than Iraq or Libya did. One being that Venezuelans have lived under democracy before corruption scandals in the late 80s and early 90s led to the election of Hugo Chavez and the end of legitimate democracy in the country. They also don't have serious religious or tribal feuds to fuel sectarianism like foreign and domestic extremist groups did after the fall of Saddam or Gaddafi. You may run into a little more cartel lawlessness or pro-Maduro rebellion in the transitional period, but it's not like the Venezuelan law enforcement has been especially effective against cartels in the past, and I don't think Venezuelans really want to fight other Venezuelans. Not to mention Venezuela has much more stable and friendly nations surrounding them, which Iraq did not. Iran wanted nothing more than Saddam out of power, since he was largely the bulwark preventing them from spreading their tentacles throughout the region. And southern and eastern border regions of Syria were already struggling with violence and extremism, which easily expanded into Iraq after the collapse of the government. Libya had been fighting Islamic revolutionaries since the 90s and was in the middle of a civil war at the time of the NATO intervention that led to the capture and killing of Gaddafi. So acting like Venezuela will become an all-out turf war, like we've seen in the Middle East and North Africa, isn't all that realistic. Beyond the repressive government and market opportunities, we should be putting much more pressure on governments to step up and stop permitting cartels to operate with impunity. And if that government can't stop them or is permitting them, then we should be asking for permission to go after them in a more coordinated effort. We currently have a greater ability to press Venezuela because it's already sanctioned and treated as an adversarial nation, as opposed to Mexico, who's a major trading partner, shares a long border, and cannot be treated like an enemy state without immediate consequences on migration, supply chains, and domestic security. More trafficking into the US may come from Mexico, but our domestic and economic policy is much more intertwined with theirs, making it much more complex to fight against Mexican cartels and apply any serious pressure to the government. And more broadly, I think it's a long time coming that the US takes offensive measures against cartels in Central and South America, and starting in Venezuela makes sense based on the considerations I just mentioned. We spent 20 years going halfway across the world to supposedly defend Americans and the American way of life, but the groups actually doing the most direct damage to Americans are cartels. Simply freezing 1 out of 100 bank accounts or arresting a few top members is not going to stop smuggling operations, stop turf wars, or reorient economies away from the money and investment that stems from trafficking. Clearly, cartels have spent the past 50 years ingraining themselves in the social, political, and economic lives of many people in South and Central America, making them increasingly harder to remove, which means you have to start with their structural support. So the Trump administration is right for going after Maduro, so long as there's someone to properly take over in the aftermath. We've seen what happens with regime change without anyone specific in mind, and luckily the Venezuelan opposition party has that person, and is cheering Trump on. Creating stability in Venezuela could start a great chain reaction against cartels and trafficking routes in the region, and a friendly Venezuela creates many opportunities for both their country and ours. But foreign policy goals like this require a lot of planning and contingencies, so we can be successful without being dragged into yet another 20-year power vacuum or nation-building project. And for now, we're just going to have to see what the new year brings. Thank you for watching. Let me know whether you think the administration should pull back and stick with economic measures or push ahead with more military strikes. If you enjoyed, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.